Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning. My name is Sanjay Mishra. I'm an associate fellow at Verizon, and I have the pleasure to introduce on my right Jonathan Candy. Please introduce yourself.
Jonathan Candy. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Quill.
And on my left,
Michael Fay. Recently with Disney, brought on to launch the Disney Plus platform for the last 4 years. And prior to that, about 2 decades with CDNs, most recently Akamai Technologies.
All right. So here this morning, we wanted to share with you what jointly we have done in terms of open caching. So let's start with, if I can move the slide over. Yeah, there it is. So, okay, so I play the slide and then I answer the question as well.
So what is open caching?
What is open caching? Very good question. So let's kind of step back a little bit before I go into the open caching. So I will first simply say that open caching is a standard-based implementation of CDN. It's functionally very similar to CDN in the fact that content providers today, they use CDNs, commercial delivery network, content delivery network, to reach their subscribers. And how the CDNs are set up, CDNs typically build out their network switches, routers, etc. in the data centers, and then they connect to ISPs over what we call as peering links. And so in certain data centers, they'll connect to an ISP so that they can reach those subscribers on behalf of the content providers to whom they're serving. So that's typically the CDN model. And 2 things to remember is that CDNs, they're generally have a pretty good infrastructure, and they spread out globally, and they have data centers where they're connecting to all these ISPs. So that's the model that typically exists. And so how does open caching fits into that? So it's very similar, as I said, functionally to open caching, to the CDN, except that there are a couple of different attributes in open caching. One is that it is standards-based. As I said, the standard meaning much of the open caching is based on work that has been done in IETF's CDNI working group. So it's based on standards. And what that means is that it makes the implementation uniform and easier. And the second attribute, which is even more important, is that open caching brings in ISPs into the mix of content delivery. They are actively engaged in bringing the content to the user. And how that happens is that ISPs deploy these open caching, these servers, deep into their ISP network. And what that means is that it allows ISPs to bring content very close to the end user. And from there, they can distribute the content. So that's like a long and short of what open caching is. So I can't read the question here, but I think the question says, it says, let me go back if that's the right question. Oh, so we covered that. The second is, what inspired Verizon to build open caching into its network architecture? So I'll take this question. So what inspired, essentially there are 2 things. One is the network efficiency, and the second thing is also network efficiency and trying to manage our resources better. And what that means is that what we have seen is the trend has shifted really from your traditional content delivery and the bits that used to flow. The pattern of viewing is changing to the fact that about 70% of the content on the internet is video. And so the ISPs have to adjust. Either they can keep throwing money at continue to build the network, or try to figure out how smartly they can configure their network efficiently that they can deliver, they can accommodate the growing percent of content that is being delivered. So I will let my colleagues kind of jump into that and kind of explain a little bit, not as to what Verizon is doing, but in generally what you're seeing, and then I'll add some more to our. I'll jump to the next question. All right, so we'll come back to this, and I'll add a little bit more to it, but let's jump into the next question here.
Yeah, the question is, what have we learned about open caching from the real results of streaming events that are happening today? I'm with Quill. we run as you can think of Quilt, we stitch together all of these different individual ISP networks together so that there's a unified platform by which one can commercially operate and provision across them. There are some, I'd say, very large sporting events in the fall that are proprietary to being streamed. Some of the things we found that are really interesting are there's smaller ISPs across the United States, for instance. If you don't know who the NCTC is, they're a conglomeration of a bunch of smaller ISPs, but in size, they're roughly the same size as Comcast from a subscriber perspective. Inside of those networks, the QoE for streaming really far deep into a really small rural ISP was just awful. The experience was not what major sporting brands want to see, major streaming brands want to see. By being able to deploy servers deep into those networks and provide a means of caching inside of that network, you can imagine somebody in a small rural town in Nebraska, their stream previously was being backhauled to Denver. Now they actually have a cache inside the network, and it's driven from that cache inside their network. Their QoE went up significantly. So to be able to handle those large spikes inside of major events where it comes on and traffic just hits, those networks could not possibly handle that before. Now they can.
And to build on that a little bit, so from a content perspective, it was not uncommon that as traffic volumes grew, as content became more available in individual regions, that an ISP would reach out directly to the content operator and say, hey, content operator, we're seeing big spikes in consumption. You just did a press release. You just signed 4, 5, 10 million subscribers in our region. What can you do from your company to help us, the ISP, manage traffic better? We don't want to do any more deals with the ISP. We don't want to do any more deals from the ISP's perspective with CDNs because maybe the commercial relationships don't work out in their favor. One of the conversations that I would often have with the ISPs and service providers regionally was, have you looked at the open caching architecture? Have you looked at adopting your own CapEx model, a software layer that was open that brands and content owners could use to help manage the peaks and troughs of content demand? What I felt open caching did and has done for the last, Sanjay, 7 years?
7 years.
7 years. What I felt open caching has done really well from a service provider's perspective is give those ISPs the opportunity to solve their own problem, invest in an open standard framework where they could approach content operators like the Disneys, like the Netflixes, like the Major League Baseball, and say, listen, we have a standard framework that runs on our infrastructure. If you were to use it, we would be able to work out favorable commercial relationships at high quality because on-net to on-net eyeballs works really well. From a content operator's perspective, it gave us an option to talk to the ISPs and say, listen, it's not just about using CDNs for delivery. There is technology out in the market that is very standardized, very approachable, very easy to operate. A far better dialogue between a content operator and a service provider than the content operator having to learn how Deutsche Telekom's CDN works or Telefonica's CDN works, in addition to Akamai's and Fastly's. By having the open caching standard, you could have common configurations. You could have capacity APIs. The content owner really won, and the service provider really won. And it has really, in the last 4 or 5 years, started gaining some more material adoption, not only with the service providers, but also with the content operators.
Yes, and I think I'll add one more to what you just said. The trends that we have seen in our network, for example, in the mobile network over the last 5 years, we have seen the volume jump 129% over the last 5 years. And if we look at for the last half of 2023, we have seen jump of 47% of the traffic that we are carrying on mobile network is video. So these are some significant numbers. And if we talk about sports that you mentioned, Jonathan, what we're seeing is that in the NFL stadiums last year, we see on an average usage consumption within the stadium per user was 101 megabits per second, 101 megabytes as far as they're consuming. This is just the NFL stadium traffic that we are talking about. So we are seeking a spike into the network, and really we were able to successfully handle that traffic. Is the point. And how did we do that is essentially allowing the elasticity into our network by bringing the content closer to the user so that we are not taxiing our back end of the network, backbones in our network to bring the traffic. And as a result, we've also seen improved latency, especially in the wireless sector, as we have seen the numbers jump high, but we've also seen a good response to the latency as well.
It's interesting you mentioned, the NFL and sports, but if you take a look at a global perspective, we get to see sporting events that are off the charts that we wouldn't expect. When there's cricket in India, I can tell you across the Airtel network, open caching drives that through significantly. When there's Uruguay ends up in a football match, man, that traffic shoots up and then it's gone right away. Those are those kind of spikes that, working with those service operators in those areas, that's the only way to really handle it. Otherwise, everything's backcalled to that peering point. The peering point ends up being the congestion. That operator, if you're Verizon, right? I mean, a major event, somebody's watching something in Bangor, Maine. Do you want to have to build the network from Bangor down to Boston, or would you rather just serve it from Bangor, right? I mean, that's what I would expect your incentive to be.
That's absolutely right.
I believe Thierry Fortier wrote an article recently about diversity CDN, a different way of looking at multi-CDN. But as I listen to you guys speak, I'm thinking about it. It's not uncommon for major content operators to have 2 or 3 major global CDN providers to distribute their content. Open caching allowed some interesting stunt work to be done. So if we wanted to try something on a Verizon 5G network, it might not be a reality to deploy an Akamai node on that particular AS, but I could have a conversation with Sanjay about building out open caching and take advantage of the common configurations and do something specifically with the content on a 5G network. That level of flexibility is something we really didn't discuss here either. I mean, you get the high quality, you can get that unique scale, and frankly, also from a content operator's perspective, the economics worked right in line with what the CDN markets were yielding anyway. So it really provided a win-win situation. I think one of the biggest challenges to open caching is the PR and the marketing around it. People are we discussed this, when we were talking about the panel. Sometimes really good technologies take a couple years to gain adoption. I don't think we're going to see LTE broadcast again. EMBMS, maybe. I don't know. Do you think?
I'm not really sure on that.
Okay, maybe that's a bad example. But, open caching is just taking time for adoption. It is a really, really clever way of content operators working with ISPs while they're still getting the scale from the traditional CDNs, but allowing a lot of flexibility that doesn't really cost anybody a lot of money.
Right. So I think the key part here is standardization. So I think that is really helping. What we want to do is minimize the pain points for the content provider. We do not want them to have to do something different because they have to integrate open caching into the system. So our key objective was always to make sure that you follow the standard and you bring in something that the content providers can easily embrace without having to bear the cost for doing that. And I think in that respect, we have succeeded. Where the work needs to be done is more education, that bringing ISPs into the mix really helps deliver the content, because ISP is involved. You can keep the ISP inactive or passive, which does not really help your paying subscribers get the benefit of the over-the-top content delivery. So I think the standardization is really helping try to push that part and making it easier for content providers to be able to deploy open caching into their environment and have a mix of content delivery into their network.
I actually have a real-world example where I tend to believe this value chain that includes the content provider, the service provider, and the content delivery network provider all in one is kind of an ideal scenario. And there was a very large sporting event in the UK, and the content provider actually reached out and said, hey, we're seeing some problems in a certain area. In our case, we picked up the phone and were able to reach out to that service provider, and their desire to have that conversation was huge, right? In our model, they have part of the revenue share, but they also don't want to have that go back to a scenario where they have to backhaul that traffic, right? They're not building their network that way. So they were in the value proposition of fixing the problem versus just saying, hey, that's kind of your issue for now. And I think that value proposition of everybody being together in the same goal of servicing the end user is really the key aspect here.
Absolutely. And we have seen successful numbers in terms of carrying live events, especially sporting events. And we're seeing that the open caching can easily scale and carry the live traffic just as well as video on demand or gaming or downloads, etc., which is passive video. But importantly, what I wanted to call out is that open caching scales very well to live content delivery as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the topics of scale and on the topic of standardization, another real world example. You're a content operator and you have a lot of live events, or you have a lot of live sports with unforecastable demand. You think it's going to be great, but it might not be great. Maybe it's an episodic or theatrical release. Maybe the content's popular. Maybe the content's not popular. You do the best you can. You guess your way through it. Having a ton of experience on the multi-CDN side, the real-world example of drama from a content operator's perspective is you do a deal with Akamai, and you have your Akamai configurations. So you have someone on staff who has to deal with the Akamai configurations. And then you have a relationship with Fastly. And now you have to deal with the VCLs and the Fastly configuration. And then maybe you have another relationship with Media CDN or Google Cloud or maybe an Edgio. They also have different configurations. The standardization that's enabled through open caching creates an environment where the content operator, instead of having to hire more and more and more people to handle all of these multi-CDN configs to get the scale they need, can apply one common configuration using the open caching standards and publish those to the people who participate in this standard. The content operators get away with having one or two people on staff that just manage these multi-CDN relationships, and the content goes up and it all functions the same way, and everybody adopts those open caching configuration standards. It is a much leaner way for the content operators to drive their business because, frankly, we just didn't have the appetite to learn VCL, to learn Akamai's config, to learn Media CDN's config, to learn whatever CloudFront needs us to do. Just didn't have enough people. The standards made it possible that we could get that scale with 2 or 3 people working on staff and deliver major sports, major content as lean as possible.
Absolutely. And one aspect we did not mention is that much of the work that is being done in open caching is within the Streaming Video Technology Alliance, which is an industry association where, as you said, Jonathan, it's the technology vendors, it's the content providers, it's the CDNs, and it's the ISPs are working together to find a common solution to the problem that exists across the ecosystem. So within the SVTA, much of the work has been done to standardize, and what they're doing is that they're taking those standards that the specs that they're writing and taking it into the IETF, and IETF has currently published 2 RFCs pertaining to open caching, and there are like 6 or 7 other documents that are being worked at this time that will also standardize functions such as the logging that you just mentioned. That function is being worked within the IETF to make logging standard so that everybody can follow the same process. So I think that's the benefit of the standards, and I think I see from the content provider point of view, because the question for them is that I have 3 CDNs that I'm currently using. Why should I use a 4th CDN or an open caching? The answer is simply that it's a plug and play for your system. There's nothing more you need to do. But the benefit on the second part, meaning as far as reaching your subscribers and seeing the latency and seeing the higher bit rate, that's tremendous value back to you to keep your subscribers, paying subscribers happy.
I'm curious, Michael, where do you, you say, it's taken time for this to get there. Where do you see it going next? Do you see anybody, coming onto this that kind of will turn some eyes, or what's your thought?
Yeah, in the last couple months, I've been on a variety of conversations with brands, major brands like Netflix, people that are getting into live sports, where they're starting to have to figure out how they're going to manage peak demand and the relationships between the peaks and the standards. And they're starting to explore things like how they could deploy their network on ISPs, the opportunities that open caching might present to the market. There's been a variety of content companies that have shown interest in the open caching standards. There has always been a lot of interest from the service providers, probably commercially focused. That makes a lot of sense. There has been in history, a little bit of an anemic investment from the content operators in open caching because yet it's another thing to do. But I'm starting to see that change in the last 6 months. And I really do think it's the popularity of sports content. It's, some of the changes in some of the content operators having to deal with maybe a surprise in a region like South Korea, where they may need to put traffic and have to have conversations with South Korea Telecom and say, well, it's not an option to use more Akamai. It's not an option to use more Fastly. What do we need to do? The last thing I would want to hear from South Korea Telecom is, have you looked at our CDN? I'm like, no, we don't have people for that. Have you looked at open caching? And they usually go away and say, yeah, we're going to go away and look at it. The popularity has increased in the last 6 months. So I'm willing to bet we're going to see a lot more adoption. And that adoption is going to show up in the SVTA. And another plug for the SVTA is, what a great organization. I mean, for engineers that are looking to contribute their signature to our industry, it's a great place for people to write their white papers, collaborate with major brands like Verizon, like Disney, like SiriusXM. It's a great sandbox for people to start working on new projects. I'm very excited about the capacity API, where you could ping a CDN and get capacity back that they might have on a particular AS. Very interesting to the content operators.
We have a lot of customers using it.
Yeah, it's a very good thing.
Yes, and that incidentally is one of the work that is going to be done in the standards. And I think, with that, we're going to wrap up. But before we wrap up, I'm going to give you the last word here, Jonathan.
Oh, I wasn't expecting that. Thank you for your time. There you go.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.